Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. All right.
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for Hannah. All right. So let's start and welcome everyone. This is recorded, by the way. So I guess more people will be able to see and watch this in the next few days and in the next few weeks. Let me just introduce myself. My name is Ruanni Tupas. I am an associate professor of sociolinguistics and education at the Institute of Education, University College London. I am the also actually the program leader of the MA program in TESOL in service, and at the same time also the module leader of the MA Language Politics Education module, which is actually the module from which emerge all the papers that will be presented today. I am personally also excited to listen to the presentations. I was, to be honest, also blown away by the range of issues and the theoretical, diversity of the papers that have been submitted to the class. And I thought perhaps we should put together a series of panels that can feature some of these papers and some of these issues, so people can actually also start or continue the conversation as well. But of course, just to remind everybody, the limits of the presentations and the papers themselves, these were papers that were presented or submitted within a semester's time frame. And so the point of the whole exercise today is really to to give us a wide range of talking points in conversations about language, politics, and education. And hopefully, if you're interested, you can actually push the conversations forward and, perhaps put together a research design that can actually even investigate further some of these issues as well. Without further ado, of course, I'd like to start off with our first panel on heritage languages. But just to alert you, one of the students in this panel cannot make it, Fancy, because of severe COVID. So she couldn't make it. So there will only be two presentations. I'm sure excellent presentations nevertheless. All right. So let's start with Nuria then. Nuria?
Hi. Let
Hello.
me quickly share my screen with you guys. Um, can you all see that?
That's right. Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. So, hi, my name is Nuria Benitez, and I'm a student in applied linguistics. And my topic is on heritage speakers and language learning, on online language learning, as seen through data on TikTok. So I chose this topic because I myself have been trying to learn my heritage languages, Chinese and Filipino, in various ways. And I've tried a lot of online learning platforms. And something I noticed was a difficulty in matching my accent with the course's accents. And this led me to wonder about the experiences of other heritage language learners, which led to my research questions of what obstacles do heritage language learners face when attempting to learn their heritage language online? What are the ideologies that underpin these obstacles and our responses to them? And specifically, due to my data, I asked, how do Vietnamese language learners interact with and experience online language courses, and what ideologies affect and influence this? So before we get into it, some background. Heritage languages are languages that are connected to one's heritage, and are often used in the case of immigration. So they're usually a language of your home country or your parents' home country, or the home language that you speak or that your parents speak. It's usually a minority language in the society that the people are in, although it might be a majority language in the home country. And it is not usually taught in mainstream schools in that society. Speakers of heritage languages have different levels of fluency, which is often generationally based. So the first generation immigrants are usually fluent in their heritage language, second generation a little bit less, and then usually by fourth generation, people don't really speak their heritage languages, although they are exposed to it from their parents and their grandparents, etc. Heritage language learners, therefore, have a unique connection to their heritage language through their identity, as well as a unique approach to learning in comparison to L2 learners of the same language. Specifically, all of this is regarding to investment. So their identity is different, their motivations for learning the language is different, and usually they're exposed to a specific variety of that language, and it's usually a non-prestigious or a diasporic variety of that language. As for learning online, this has gotten a lot more popular as an alternative to mainstream in-person classes. It's more accessible, it's less expensive, it's self-paced, so you can kind of tailor it to your own needs. And it's also been proven to alleviate some classroom anxiety or some performance anxiety because there's nobody in front of you, there's no one there. But it's also been proven that a lot of this classroom anxiety may actually have to do with standard language ideology instead of just performance anxiety. And standard language ideology is the belief that a language has fixed, easily identifiable forms with a clear delineation between standard, that is like a prestigious, powerful, or correct variety, and a non-standard variety, which is not prestigious, which is minoritized and sometimes considered wrong. And this can cause a lot of discrimination and prejudice as people make judgments based on the way that one speaks. So as for the data itself, I looked at this TikTok video where you have in the first picture here, we have this person learning Vietnamese by himself in the West, looking at like YouTube tutorials and like copying audio recordings, things like that. And then he goes and tells a friend in the second picture that he's learning Vietnamese and tries to say, "What's your name?" But the friend doesn't understand, and then realizes it's because the friend speaks a Southern accent and the initial person learned the Northern accent. And so it's a TikTok, so there's like a knife sound, it goes black and white, there's like ringing and all that stuff. But basically in the final conclusion of the TikTok, it's that most overseas Vietnamese speak in the Southern dialect, but that the Northern dialect is what's taught. And the caption at the bottom is ends up learning both accents. So with Vietnamese, there are three varieties of Vietnamese. There's Northern, Southern, and Central Vietnamese. Northern is what's taught in schools as the standard in Vietnam and also often outside of Vietnam. And there are a lot of tensions between Northern and Southern due to the Vietnam War. And so my study focuses on Vietnamese immigration to the West, predominantly the US, even though it's all online, it's a TikTok, and so I can't really know where the people are from, but I needed to kind of limit my analysis. And so looking at the US, there have been waves of immigration from Vietnam to the US, primarily by Southern Vietnamese, and primarily after the Vietnam War, or like towards the end of the Vietnam War. And so because of that, most overseas Vietnamese, especially in the US, speak Southern Vietnamese, just like the TikTok says. So the data that I looked at was the TikTok itself, but also primarily the comments and their replies on the comment thread. And so I looked at 4 main comment threads among the top liked threads. And I identified specific recurring themes or ideologies that were prevalent in those comments. These were very overlapping in each comment, but the sort of themes that I identified were firstly that Northern Vietnamese is the standard, and this was said in both a positive and negative way. There's resistance against standard language ideology. There were positive views of Southern Vietnamese, and also community-specific ideologies surrounding Northern Vietnamese as well. So for the Northern as a standard language variety, here we have an example. There were other examples for this, but the reply here just says it straight up. Northern is the standard Vietnamese. And so in the comments, they see Northern as the accurate or actual Vietnamese, and also as the variety that people should learn or should want to learn, despite the fact that heritage learners want to learn Vietnamese to communicate with their loved ones. And that last point is kind of shown in this example here, which shows also some resistance against standard language ideology. In the very beginning, we have someone choosing not to use Duolingo because it only teaches Northern. But there are also comments that show asking for alternatives that teach Southern instead of Northern, or learning both varieties, like in the TikTok itself. And this example actually continues on. They have like a whole other page of debates about like Northern versus Southern and why you should learn one or the other. There are also positive views of Southern Vietnamese. So for example, in this comment, we have Northern Vietnamese being the actual Vietnamese. So that's still standard language ideology. But then the commenter still says, I don't care because South on top. So there's still positive views of Southern Vietnamese, which sort of goes against standard language ideology that typically sees the non-prestigious varieties to be in a negative light. There are also community-specific ideologies that surround Northern Vietnamese. So it's not just like positive views of Southern, but also sometimes negative views of Northern by those who speak Southern or by those in the diaspora. So in this comment, we have Northern Vietnamese being related to being a Viet Cong. And so a lot of these ideologies come from those who migrated after the Vietnam War. So it's very community specific, but also very strong for those people, and that can influence their children's learning. And so what can we conclude from all of this data? So my conclusions are that we can see that heritage language learners have really complex identities, and they often wish to communicate better with their loved ones who usually speak non-prestigious varieties, in this case, Southern Vietnamese. But most online learning language classes teach standard varieties, so in this case, the Northern variety. And so heritage language learners then either stop using these courses and stop learning in some ways, or they have to learn both the standard and non-standard varieties. So there's actually a very high desire for other non-standard varieties of languages to be available for heritage language learners to learn their language online. But this is largely ignored by online classes who treat their students as like a single homogeneous unit and therefore kind of ignore that need for a non-standard variety to be taught. And yeah, that's it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Excellent, Nuria. Perhaps you can just, go on screen and stop sharing so we can ask more questions. Yeah. No, so it's actually fascinating work. But before I actually ask if anyone also has some questions, you can type them in the chat, or if you are fine, you can ask the question orally, okay? Or probably not a question, but a comment as well. But I guess I'm actually interested, Nuria, on what suggestions you might give. I mean, based on your experience, because I know that you struggled over the data, how to put them together. Perhaps you can talk a little bit more about that and why it's TikTok specifically, because I've had students in the past also trying TikTok but actually gave up because somehow the data do not help you organize things in other words. Yeah, so I mean, but it's fascinating though. I mean, you mentioned earlier that there's like you can't really like differentiate between like an account that says this and says that, because there are overlapping ideologies and views in the same account or whatever like that. So I mean, can you talk us through about these difficulty of yours and how you actually got to this point?
Yeah, I will say TikTok is not friendly to those who want to do research on it.
Yeah.
I mean, I found it because like I knew that there were these types of conversations on TikTok. And I will say I had to make a decision between more like multimodal analysis of the TikTok itself versus looking at the comments. And it was a bit difficult also because you know, it moves so fast online. So I had to take screenshots. And then like because TikTok arranges it based on how many likes you get. If I went when I went later on, it was in a different order. And the comments are also in different orders sometimes.
Mm.
And so like if you see one of the examples there, like he didn't finish, they didn't finish their comment, so they continued it on, but the comment was like three later. So you have to kind of parse out who's saying what, how are they replying to each other, and all of that stuff. And it's really difficult because people do really reply and like debate in the replies
Mm.
of specific comments. Um, and so for me, it took a really long time, and I mostly had to isolate the replies in specific ways. And there were a lot of individuals who commented multiple times, especially when they were like debating. Um, and I had to kind of just decide what is the main like message of this
Mm.
person, what is the main theme, and use that as my analysis instead of like the whole discourse and like their
Oh.
debate.
Mm. Mm. There's one question in the comment section by Mingdan. Hi Mingdan, thanks for this. Um, she asked, how would we know that they are actually learning Vietnamese, but actually not performing to be an influencer? In other words, if I got you right, I hope I got you right. Like that they are just simply there as influencers, that they are really not learning or learning that
Yeah.
Vietnamese. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was actually a big reason why I decided to focus on the comments instead of the actual TikTok because so like obviously I like stalked the guy a little bit and like tried to see like, you know, are you a Vietnamese heritage speaker, right? All of these things. And I couldn't really figure it out. And it is a skit, so it was very possible that, you know, this person was just doing like a skit as an influencer.
Hmm.
And that this wasn't necessarily like a personal experience that they had. So that was why I focused a little bit more on the comments themselves, because those were people who were saying, this was my experience, you know, I wanted to learn it for my family, you know, all of these things. Um, but yeah, you like when you're doing online data, you don't, there's only so much you can know about the person who's saying all of these things.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much, Nuria. I think it was an excellent presentation, and then I hope you or anyone else can actually pursue this work as well because it is fascinating. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Let's move on to the next. For those who just came in, unfortunately, um, one of our students cannot make it today because of COVID. So we are moving on to Sophie, who's got another, sharing, which I believe is also really fascinating. Something that has got to do with the politics of language in Gibraltar. Hi, Sophie.
Hello, I'm just going to share my screen. Is that working? Okay. Okay, so I focused my essay on Llanito, which is commonly known as a code-switch dialect of Gibraltar English, Gibraltar Spanish, culturally specific words, and other loanwords from other Mediterranean dialects such as Genoese or Ladino, which is indigenous to Gibraltar, where I'm from. Um, However, my paper does propose that this definition of Llanito succumbs to traditional and codified views of language. And instead, this paper suggests that a translingual view of Llanito is more appropriate for Gibraltar's language situation. So Ophelia Garcia characterizes translanguaging as the linguistic behavior of bilinguals as being heteroglossic, responding not to one monolingualism, but one integrated linguistic system. So translingualism posits that languages should not be bound by linguistic borders and boundaries, which is very relevant to Gibraltar. So this paper uses Garcia's characterization and argues that Llanito presents one integrated linguistic system in itself. Um, So a study on Llanito's undergoing a study of Llanito as a linguistic system needs to consider how it's undergoing language loss and language endangerment. So while there have been papers that have examined the sociolinguistics and phonetics of Llanito, this is the first academic study to investigate Llanito as an endangered heritage language. This paper uses two original questionnaires to assess the extent of Llanito's language endangerment and uses this data to make recommendations for language reclamation and revitalization. This paper also argues that educational policy and community intervention are extremely important and required for the revitalization of Llanito among young generations, and shows that there is a willingness to preserve Llanito within the Gibraltarian community. To show this, I used Jim Humans and Leanne Hinton's language revitalization policies as exemplary and used both questionnaires to show a desire to save Llanito along with these policies. So this paper explores the symbiotic relationship between language and culture through Llanito and shows how Gibraltar's colonial history has exerted a strong influence on the evolution of Llanito. So Gibraltar is a British overseas territory. It was captured by Dutch forces during the War of Spanish Succession in 1704 and formally escaped from Spain to Britain under the Treaty of Utrecht. And this paper pretends that Llanito's socio-historical roots can be traced throughout Gibraltar's 19th and 20th century. So importantly, the 19th century saw a huge influx of immigrants to Gibraltar, such as people from Genoa, Moroccan people, Portuguese people, Indian people, and Maltese immigrants who joined the Spanish, Jewish people, and British military officials who were already present on the rock. And so over time, this informed the language situation. And while Spanish remained the dominant language, these other dialects and languages informed the language spoken on the rock. And so in the 20th century, events like the evacuation of women and children to London during the World War II and the closure of the Spanish Gibraltarian border by the Spanish dictator Franco would politicize the use of Spanish and encourage the use of English. So the situation in Gibraltar is very complex. While it remains under British sovereignty, there's a strong separate Gibraltarian identity in and of itself. And while arguments for British military protection against Spanish claims remain strong, independence for Gibraltarians has become associated more with separation from Spain rather than separation from Britain. And so it's interesting in this way because looking back at Gibraltarian history, imperialism is definitely very evident, British imperialism, but there has still remained a loyalty to Britain here. So, for example, the Clifford Report in 1944 focused on the British education of dominant Spanish-speaking students, which was the majority of students in Gibraltar at the time. This report emphasized the importance of the imperial connection as paramount to ensure that the future generations shall be British in something more than name and share equally with other members the English language, culture, and tradition. This paper views language as a repository of past experience. Therefore, this English spoken in Gibraltar today is presented as a form of colonial lingualism that can be found in this report. Llanito, however, in itself reflects Gibraltar's hybridity and almost acts as a resistance to this English culture and tradition, which is why it's so important that Llanito as an endangered heritage language should be preserved. So the first step to losing a heritage language is when a generation of speakers who grew up speaking the language at home are more comfortable with, as I say, the conquering language, which is certainly true of younger generations in Gibraltar now, who are tending towards English more than Spanish or Llanito. And this is something that my questionnaires show. I'm just going to skip this one. So the first questionnaire I carried out analyzes the language choices of 373 workers from Gibraltar from the civil service as the likely parents of generations in which the use of Llanito is decreasing. So my second questionnaire does focus on educators as policy actors and their observations about language in Gibraltar state schools. And my questionnaires are informed by Prem FIEC's engagement with language minoritized communities and dialoguing about the impacts of dominant language policies in their communities. It recognizes language choice as a political concept and cultural capitals that validate monolingual ideologies in education. Therefore, my questionnaires mostly consist of open-ended questions, and where they didn't, options that there was no limit on how many options a respondent could choose or how long a response could be. So this paper, like FIRE, is committed to epistemic justice, which legitimizes the status of language minoritized speakers as epistemic beings. So the first questionnaire, receiving 373 responses, asked some important questions. So when asked whether they thought Llanito was important for Gibraltarian society and why they thought this, the majority of respondents connect Llanito with cultural heritage and cultural identity. Llanito as an endangered language is the majority view held by 90.3 participants. And when asked if they prefer that Llanito dies out, the overwhelming majority expressed concern about Llanito's growing loss. One participant in particular describes this as a national tragedy for Gibraltar, and another participant also notes that its loss feels colonial, like absorption for the sake of appearing more British. Others claim to have been shouted at for using Llanito in school, highlighting the role of language choice and the influence of imperial ideologies that contribute to a loss of Llanito. Other participants, however, claimed Llanito was indicative of poor education and as people having not taken the time to learn English or Spanish correctly. Out of the 268 respondents who have children, 203 claim to speak Llanito to their children. However, when asked why they do or do not speak Llanito, the majority of respondents admit that while they attempt to integrate Llanito into speech, English is soon reverted to, as children don't respond in Llanito. 66.6% of respondents also did not think Llanito should have a lower status, but answers were varied considering whether Llanito should be an official language in Gibraltar. 82% of the respondents note a trend where younger people use English mixed with Llanito in order to in contrast to older generations who use Spanish mixed with Llanito. 86% of Gibraltarians also have a sentimental value attached to Llanito, and some respondents note language adaptation or change instead of loss, but do think this is the step to loss. Indeed, other participants also believe this language change is progressive to English monolingual society, which is something that also concerns them. So my second questionnaire also consisted of responses from 15 educators in Gibraltar. So the majority of teachers preferred Llanito when asked which languages they used to tell stories to friends and family, but said they would use English to write an essay. Younger educators opted for English or English and Llanito as the language in which they used to communicate, whereas older educators mostly opted for Llanito and Spanish or all three languages. Despite this, all educators state that they would use English only to tell a story to students, with only one respondent adding that they will sometimes use Llanito as well, even though it's the story they use to tell stories outside of school. Respondents prefer English to write a diary, which reflects the oral storytelling mode of Llanito in Gibraltar, as kind of the written form seems to always stick to English. All educators believe that Llanito should be used in the classroom in primary education before GCSE and A-level to maintain the language among younger generations, but admit this becomes difficult in secondary education where students have to abide by GCSE, A-levels, and the British education system. Additionally, all educators maintain that a lack of Spanish in early primary teaching is disadvantaging the linguistic repertoires of young students, as Spanish isn't introduced until year 3 and only one time a week. The majority of educators were also unsure what the governmental policy about language and education was. Um, besides the assertion that English is definitely the language of instruction in Gibraltar schools, and respondents also highlight a lack of Spanish and Llanito used in the home, which they're seeing reflected in the classroom. However, they do agree that they think educational policy can seek to remedy this. So this paper uses a combination of Leanne Hinton and Jim Cummins and their strategies for language protection to propose a suitable framework for Llanito's language protection. So, um, Hinton emphasizes the value of community efforts, whereas Cummins approaches places importance on cross-cultural language learning and education. So Cummins highlights that overcoming the prevalence of monolingual instructional assumptions is pertinent for language reclamation. Um, he says interdependence across languages within language learning heightens a student's translingual disposition. Therefore, strong L1 and L2 relationships capitalized on under his strategies for literary aspects of language learning, and students are seen to use L1 to facilitate L2 understanding. So cross-linguistic strategies not only enable students to bring their languages together through additive approaches, it also emphasizes that their L1 proficiency is important and shows connections between both languages. Whereas Leanne Hinton advocates for active communal language reclamation that can begin with the introduction of a few words or short speeches in the heritage language, both at home and in school. She encourages the collection of linguistic publications and sound recordings as part of community-based research and resources, and advises the creation of audio recordings of existing speakers to help influence the speech of young students. So, for example, having older people come into the classroom and speak to younger students. And this emphasizes the importance of developing a writing system through which community-based dictionaries should be encouraged both by education and the community. So combining both these strategies combines both the classroom and a combination of languages to show that all languages are important, and combines community engagement to show that language revitalization has to be a communal effort and that the onus can't just lie on these students and the children. So the possibility of language reclamation always lies within the next generation, but help is definitely needed from the community to encourage and inspire them. My personal show that there is hope for Llanito, there is a strong desire to revitalize it, but interventions are certainly required to ensure Gibraltar's heritage language is protected against language loss, interventions that Gibraltar is not currently seeing. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sophie. A few questions from Farhana, if you can see actually the comments. Yeah, I think the first one is basically just to ask about how you disseminated the questionnaire.
Okay. So what I did was I got in touch with the government in Gibraltar because I wasn't sure how to quickly access companies because as well in Gibraltar the majority of workers work in the civil service, whereas in the private sector you normally find people who or the majority of people didn't necessarily grow up in Gibraltar. So I emailed the chief secretary and he sent the questionnaire to the civil service and I then got all my responses. And then is Llanito prevalent in Gibraltar's cultural media scene?
It's easy to email the chief secretary and ask the chief secretary
Yeah,
to
in
send it.
Gibraltar it is, yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. That's another question
Yeah.
here. Yeah, from Farhana as well. Is Llanito prevalent in Gibraltar's cultural media scene, like for example, the movies and music and videos and so on?
So there is it's growing. So we have GBC, which is the Gibraltar Broadcast Association Corporation, and They now sometimes have evening segments where the presenter will speak in Llanito, but mostly if you look at the Gibraltar Chronicle, for example, that will definitely be English, which I think reflects the tendency to use English because it's the language Gibraltarians are educated in as a form of writing, and also because Llanito isn't really a written form. It doesn't have a standard written form. Some people don't feel comfortable writing Llanito, although saying that there is a big move now to Gibraltarian literature, and that's starting to see people use different interpretations of how Llanito should be written in the literature. So it's getting there. It's not fully fledged, but it's in its beginnings in terms of being used in the media. But in the cultural scene, it's definitely there. Everyone speaks it all the time. So I guess even if an event isn't centered around it, the people participating in the event will definitely be using it to communicate and tell stories.
Is this a case? I mean, before I go to Mingdan, because Mingdan has a question here. Just broadly speaking, is this a case of like, all right, this is ours because it represents us. This is our identity. This is who we are as as a community, for example. Is it a case of this, but at the same time that it shouldn't be taught, or we don't have high regard. I mean, generally speaking, of course, of this particular, linguistic repertoire,
Yeah,
if you call it that.
exactly. It definitely doesn't have much prestige attached to it. In Gibraltar, it's definitely English is the best way and English is the right way. So Llanito hasn't been looked down on. So it's definitely a thing where everyone speaks it and it's everyone's identity. People are passionate about it, but in terms of passing it down to their kids, people on this become slightly more reluctant because they feel that children have to have a good grasp of English and that Llanito might stop this good grasp of English or interfere with it in some way. Um, and because it doesn't have much prestige and because there are always tensions with Spain as a neighbor and Llanito is perhaps more similar to Spanish. It's
Mm,
also true that some people associate both of them and think that if you promote Llanito, you're promoting Spanish, and it's kind of almost a political tension.
mm,
So
mm.
yeah, but there definitely is no prestige attached to it.
Yeah, Mingdan is asking about the questionnaire, because it seems that the questionnaire does not ask about translanguaging, but your presentation starts with and includes the
Mhm.
theory. So is there a way to link the two?
Yeah, I thought that if I started um, using words like translanguaging and theoretical words in the questionnaire, that might not translate well to the audience, or they might not have a good understanding of what it could be. So instead, I kind of used questions that suggested. So I asked them which languages they preferred and gave them no limit on which options they could use, and asked them leading questions about their languages and how they use their languages, to kind of get answers about whether they see Llanito as something separate, something that's just code switching, to see how they use English, Spanish, and Llanito together. So while the word translanguaging wasn't mentioned, because I thought it would be confusing, I kind of used other ways to elicit responses that I could link to translanguaging.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, your presentation earlier. I mean, there were some parts that I couldn't hear because I think there were noises
Oh,
along the
sorry.
way. But now it's much much better. So sorry if I didn't pick it up earlier. But in the schools,
Mhm.
basically, how are like pupils who speak this treated? Can we, is there any like parallel to, let's say, our own experience of our own vernacular in the, like in the Philippines, for example? Very early on, we were fined if we spoke, my mother tongue, for example. Is that something that has been happening or has been experienced by the students themselves, or it's a
Mhm.
different experience altogether?
Um, so I don't think anyone has ever been fined or
Mhm.
anything like that. But definitely in some of the responses from the questionnaires among older generations, so maybe people who are 50, 60, do report having been shouted at for speaking any of Spanish in the classroom if they weren't speaking English, or told off, or told that that was a bad thing. And while that was less prevalent when I was in school, definitely students who had a better command of English were seen as the intelligent ones, intelligent students. But if students didn't have a great command of English and maybe leaned towards Llanito or Spanish more, they were kind of disregarded as not intelligent or less able, like often perhaps they'd be in lower sets, and there wasn't much engagement with them as students to see what their language strengths and repertoires were. It's kind of English is the intelligent language, Llanito and Spanish are the kind of less prestigious languages. So while no one is, or in my experience, no one was told off for speaking Llanito Spanish, they were kind of looked down on for doing so.
Last question. If you were, or probably someone else would pursue this kind of work or this kind of topic, what else do you think would you need to do to expand, the research into Llanito? And I mean, in other words, how should you proceed investigating the politics of Llanito?
I think an ethnography would be really good, because in most of the academic research I've read, it's kind of a lot of academics. It's quite evident to me that they haven't necessarily visited Gibraltar or spent time in Gibraltar. They make quite sweeping statements that aren't necessarily true in my experience. And so I think research on Gibraltar would definitely benefit from ethnography, just to reflect the actual situation in Gibraltar and the actual experiences of Gibraltarians, which is important because often actual view of Gibraltarians is often sidelined in favor of bigger discourses about the Spanish view of Gibraltar or the British view of Gibraltar, and it's kind of Gibraltarian voices lost in between. I think ethnography would definitely give Gibraltarians a chance to show how they use Llanito, what it's like for them, in a way that hasn't previously been shown in academic writing.
Yeah, sorry, I said last, but you said something that caught my attention. Can you give an example of like what like a sweeping, like an overstatement or an overgeneralization?
Like recently, I've seen this academic, Christina Suarez, say that people in Gibraltar who are over 60 can't speak any English, and that's just completely untrue. Um, I'd say most Gibraltarians, obviously with varying proficiency, but people who are 60 can most definitely speak English. They would have been schooled in English. So it's kind of, it seems like there's a lack of interrogation into these things and maybe a lack of engagement into Gibraltar history properly, or just speaking to Gibraltarians, because I'm sure if she spoke to any Gibraltarian over 60, they'd definitely be able to speak to her in English. So it's just it's quite strange to read.
Yeah. Well, that's always the danger, in academic research, right? Talking about someone else's work or someone else's phenomenon, right? But I guess you're right. Probably an ethnographic approach would really be very, very helpful. All right. So yeah, I mean, excellent presentation. Thank you very much, Sophie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And also Nuria earlier, thank you. And if you can stay on, why not? Because the next set of presentations is actually a conversation. The panel will not use slides, but simply talk about their own research, hopefully in a much more informal and dialogic kind of conversation. So I'd like to I wouldn't introduce everyone because there's someone else who's taking over as a facilitator, Farhana Ahmed. Farhana is also part of the program and has actually kindly said yes to my invitation to facilitate the second panel. So over to you now, Farhana.
Thank you so much, Ruanni. I'm hoping you can hear me. Just give me a thumbs up if you can.
Yes, yes, we
Okay,
can hear
perfect.
you.
Perfect. Okay, yeah. So I am facilitating. I don't know why Ruanni trusts me this much to facilitate this panel, but I'll try to be as less chaotic as possible. But all jokes aside, my name is Farhana, and I am an intercultural communication student, and I took Ruwani's module in the fall term and really, really enjoyed that module, so highly recommend. So this panel, the topic is language, education, and inequality, and we have Ruchen, Maria, Elizabeth, and our other Elizabeth. So I'm gonna ask kindly if you can just come on camera if you feel comfortable. And I'm gonna start to spotlight everyone so that you can stay on the screen. And
Farhana?
yes.
Okay, so I won't deal with any technical stuff now. So whoever you want to spotlight, you do it so that we don't like overlap.
Sure,
All right.
no
Yeah,
problem.
thank you. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Sorry, just give me a second. I'm trying. Okay. So I guess we could start with introductions. I'm having issues with spotlighting Ruchan, but just know that she's here. Okay, so I guess we'll start off with just introductions. I'll start off with Elizabeth actually, Elizabeth Betancourt. If you could kindly just introduce yourself in about a minute, and then we'll move on to the other panelists.
Sure. Good morning, Farhana. Good morning, Maria, everyone that is with us today. My name is Elizabeth. I am from Cuba, and I was where I was teaching English and translation at the school at the Faculty of Foreign Languages of the University of Havana before coming here to pursue my master's in intercultural communication with you as well. And I was also leading a community project focused on teaching English in impoverished backgrounds in vulnerable communities in Havana as well.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to Maria. If you could kindly introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Maria, and I'm a master's student of applied linguistics. My research interests lie in language and education policy. Currently, I am undertaking my dissertation in language identity and gender in an all-girls school here in London. Previously, I've written papers on French language teaching in London and language education policy in Pakistan. So one of which I'll be talking about today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maria. And last but not least, Ruchen, if you could kindly introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ruchen, and also, I'm applied linguistics, and my topic is about the heritage language, and mostly about the hegemony of the standard language, between the Mandarin Chinese and the different dialects.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So to kick things off, the first question is tell us something about your paper. What is your paper about and why is it important? So some of you guys have already touched on this a little bit, but if we could just kind of go in order and just expand on this. So we'll start with Ruchen. If you could just share an overview of your paper, what it's about and why it's important.
As I mentioned earlier, my topics is about the hegemony language of the of the Mandarin Chinese in Shandong University, and the Shandong is one of the province in China, and we use the dialect called Shandong dialect, which is kind of similar to the Mandarin Chinese, but it have some differences in the mostly in the phonology. We have different pronunciation in some words, And the reason why I choose this topic is about because of the language ideology in China, most people may pursue to speak like standard Mandarin instead of our own dialect. So this may cause some language inequality, because if you use dialogue in some class in the classroom, you will be isolated. So some people will feel depressed or not that confident. So it is kind of inequality in the classroom. So that's one of the reasons I chose this topic.
Thank you. And Maria, do you have anything to add to that or any similar experiences? And also if you could answer this question.
Yeah, so my paper was based on linguistic and educational inequalities occurring due to language education policy in a district of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Pakistan. So in particular, I wanted to look into how cultural and linguistic capital had an impact on social mobility. I was interested in this topic because during my undergrad, I actually had, I could clearly see that the students who had their education from government schooling, they were finding it difficult to speak in English compared to the private school students, and English being more seen more as more valorized. The teachers had a preference for students who could speak English at university level. And similar was the case in the job market as well. And alongside that, I was also very well aware of how language and education was kind of a topic of debate throughout the politics of Pakistan. So in particular, during that time frame, there came this concept of single national curriculum, which was standardizing education for everyone, private, government schools, and religious schools as well. And there was like a single curriculum, and the aim was also to address linguistic inequalities throughout. So what I wanted to look into is how effective this had been a few years later. And that's why I chose this topic. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. Elizabeth, anything to add as well as your own personal experiences?
Yes, mine is similar to Maria's. I chose this topic. The title of my paper is Seeds of Change, Fighting Linguistic Inequalities in Cuba. And I chose it because as a language instructor myself, I could experience firsthand the inequalities of language instruction in my country. Like, even though the government has attempted to have English language for all and English language education for all, still significant challenges hinder students from accessing like quality language education. And in this scenario, private schooling schools have emerged to address these gaps. But then it also brings up the topic of inequalities, like children in vulnerable and impoverished communities cannot have access to this. So I wanted to explore the symbolic power of English in Cuba, how it unpacks, and as the tourism industry is dominating development, and the challenges then the educational system facing, and some strategies to address these inequalities.
Great, thank you so much. I think it's interesting that in all three examples, you discuss how even in the classroom, this amongst the students there, depending on what they speak, there is a sense of there is kind of like a hierarchy. Like if this student speaks, whether it's English or whether it's an official language of the state, if they speak that, then they're in a better position than maybe some of the other students. So I think that's quite interesting and a very stark example of inequality in the classroom. So moving on to the next question. So thank you guys for answering giving us an overview of what you guys talk about in your papers in this first round. So entering the second round, if you could kindly give us an example or two of some of the specific manifestations of linguistic or educational inequality that you discuss in your paper. So I know that in general, you guys give an overview. So if there's like maybe specific examples you could give that you discuss in your paper. So we'll start with you, Elizabeth.
Yes, I was mentioning that we have access to education, free education for everyone in Cuba. It includes English instruction since primary school. But then again, students face in this public education in schools, the lack of resources, limited practices in the classroom, limited access also to language, qualified English language teachers, because then again, as tourism dominates development in Cuba, many of these teachers prefer going into this other sector as tour guides or private schools. And then the public system again lacks qualified teachers. So the emergence of this private schooling, while addresses some of these other challenges, because many qualified English teachers prefer teaching there, and they have access to better technology and good books. At the same time, it brings also concerns about linguistic inequalities, as not everyone or just a small portion of the population can have access to these schools.
Great. So kind of just, sorry, I know this isn't one of the questions right now, but I mean, what does that do then, I guess, in the future, if you have all these qualified English speakers who are actually not in the schools and they're going into other sectors? Now, what does that, like, what do you think that does for the future of the education in these schools? Like obviously the most obvious one is that it creates learning gaps between various students. But is there anything else you can, like any other implication you can think of?
Yes, of course. For the later on in the it prevents them from having other opportunities in life for jobs and careers when they grow up. For example, as I was mentioning, that tourism is on the rise in Cuba. The best positions and the best qualified good jobs that are in tourism. So English language is of great importance for that. So not everyone can have access to this.
Great, thank you. So Maria, if you could answer this question, just give us a specific example of the manifestation of linguistic or educational inequality that you discuss in your paper.
So in my paper, so there's the private education, it was capitalizing on English only medium of instruction. Whereas the government schools, they had been instructed to teach in national language or mother tongue-based education. So this created a barrier between the two types of schooling system and the students who were learning the language. One was having better, I would say, opportunities. And when I looked into the single national, the effects after the single national curriculum, the case was still the same, because the only thing changed was the textbooks, and it was not considered that, oh, someone is has to teach this, and what is the medium of instruction, or what are the methodologies that could be used. So in particular, when I looked into the teachers training program for the government school, they had a different teachers training program, still still encouraging their traditional methods, and the private schools still encouraging their methods. And this was not standardized during like the policy change, which continued to have the same effect. And it was then like when I interviewed the teachers, they both the government school teachers and the private school teachers were showing resistance towards the change in textbook, because it was very ineffective to just change the textbooks and say, okay, this is the education can be standardized this way, because the private school teachers were not, I would say, trained well enough to be teaching something in Urdu language if a textbook or a subject was changed into Urdu language, and the government school teachers were not trained well enough to teach in English to the students. So it was, again, continuing the same cycle. That was one of the things that I found in my paper.
That's a really interesting issue, isn't it? Where you have like the government versus private school systems, and the teachers have kind of the same problem, but just in opposite languages. So English, now you have to teach something in Urdu, and then in Urdu you have to teach something in English. So, but then I think the common thing here is this idea of standardizing. Okay, so the goal was to create a standard for everybody to mitigate this linguistic inequality, but it ends up creating more problems for the people who are actually in charge of teaching this. But something that you said, this idea of standard even. So who decides what's standard? Is that something you explore in your paper? Like when they change the textbooks, I understand that there's issues with delivering the material, but was there any resistance to the material itself?
Yes, because one of the conversations that I had, it was quite interesting that the teacher was saying that the material for the private school students became too easy in English, and the material for the government school students were difficult. And the same was the case for Urdu, because the government school students were using Urdu. So for them, the Urdu material was too easy, and for the students, so that became a big problem. They were having the same problem with the students as well, that they were not, obviously, if something is easy, they would not be challenged enough, and they were not taking interest. Okay, this is a waste of time for them as well. So that was another thing that was there.
Very interesting. And then Ruanni has a question for Maria before we get to Ru Chen. So he's asking, is there a difference? Yeah, is there a difference in teaching methodologies?
In terms of, I would say, the medium of instruction was what I explored, and there was a difference there, because the teaching methodologies in private schools were English only, the instruction, and in the government schools, it had a lot to do with if the teacher, the student finds it difficult, then the teacher could change into mother tongue based language education, which was not the option given in a private education system. So that was one thing that I explored.
Great, thank you. Ru Chen, so same question, I'll repeat it. So give us an example or two of manifestations of linguistic or educational inequality drawn from your research. You can also respond to anything that Elizabeth and Maria have said so far. So the floor is yours.
As I mentioned earlier, my topic is about the hegemony of the standard Mandarin and the marginalization of other dialects in the classroom. And in my paper, I interviewed some students, some Shandong students, and asked about their views about this phenomenon. And I mainly found three, I think it's three phenomena for the language inequality. The first is about the use of language for education, and based on my interview, they told me in their classroom the only language they can use is Mandarin Chinese, and they should use Chinese in the class. They should use Mandarin in the classroom, and the teacher use Mandarin to teach them. And also, the language used in the textbook is also the Mandarin. And another impact is to their classroom engagement, because as I mentioned, they have to use Mandarin in the classroom. So some students, if they can't speak Mandarin that well, they may feel isolated, and they are afraid to share some of their views in the like group discussions, and because they are not that confident, they are kind of ashamed of their accent, so they may choose not to speak. That will be greatly influence about their classroom engagement. And also, I also find that it have an impact on the academic writing, because the standard way of the academic writing in Chinese is to use Mandarin to write. But some students, if they are not that good at Mandarin, it will have an impact on their academic writing. That's mainly three phenomena I found in my research.
So I have a question for you, Ruchen. You mentioned that the teachers, the language of instruction is Mandarin Chinese.
Yeah.
So even in the local provinces, they're still teaching Mandarin Chinese. Is that correct?
I think it's that teacher teach Mandarin Chinese because they think everyone should know how to use Mandarin Chinese.
So are the teachers themselves native Mandarin Chinese speakers?
Yeah, I think like everyone have our own dialect, but we choose to speak Mandarin Chinese most of the time.
Is it really a choice then? Is it a choice then if it's kind of expected to be learned?
I think in my provinces, we don't have many choice of whether you choose to speak Mandarin Chinese in the classroom or choose to speak Shandong dialect, because the language ideology and the language policy in my province is that we have to use Mandarin Chinese in the classroom. Well, you will be uneducated if you use dialect in the classroom. And some teachers may think if you use dialect in the classroom, you are not that respectful to them.
Interesting. So there's a respect kind of side
Yeah.
to things. Maria, Elizabeth, is this true in Cuba and in Pakistan as well? Like if you come into the classroom with your local language or your local dialect, like how is that received in the classroom?
Yeah, I think there is that respect factor there. And people, if you speak your mother tongue, so people do perceive you as less educated. In particular, in the classroom, it is frowned upon.
We don't have that case in Cuba because we only speak Spanish. is our native language, and is also the medium of instruction in Cuba.
But I'm sure even within Spanish, there's different, I guess register would be, if someone, like, I don't think someone who's from a higher social class would speak the same as someone who's maybe from a more impoverished neighborhood. I don't know, I'm making assumptions here, but is that maybe the case? Like, I would maybe just apply that to that scenario.
Yeah, that would be interesting to look into that in Cuba, with the Spanish as the medium of instruction.
Yeah, Ruanni has a question for Ruchen. What is the reality in the classroom? Is the dialect really not used? Is it strictly like, for example, Maria, you mentioned that in the government schools, if the English language is too difficult, the teacher can kind of language. They can scaffold and bring in the native language. So Ruchen, in your paper, is that discussed? Is it really that Mandarin Chinese is 100% of the time always enforced on the students, or is there some wiggle room and sometimes the dialect is allowed to be used?
I think in my province, the reality is that like everyone can understand the dialect, and not everyone can understand the Mandarin. So I think most students, they may speak Mandarin, but with a China accent. So in most times, if you like try to speak Mandarin, but you also have some accent, because it's very common to everyone. Teachers will also teachers also accept this. So, but if you can speak Mandarin, but you choose to speak the dialect, that maybe not that acceptable, because the teacher know you can speak, but you like you still speak Mandarin, like sometimes on purpose. So teacher may think it can like it is not respectful to her teaching sometimes, I think.
Okay. Well then I guess we can move on to the last round, because up until now we've talked about all the problems, but what about the solutions? Can there be change? Can we do something about this? All the various types of inequalities we've spoken about, whether it's qualified teachers moving into different sectors, whether it's the government changing textbooks or changing a curriculum, but then the reality on the ground is actually different for different students. And then also in terms of the medium of instruction, how can we reduce that gap? Maybe some of the students feel embarrassment or shame. So how can we overcome a lot of these inequalities that we've just discussed? I'll start off with Elizabeth. So what do you think?
Well, in my paper, I address one solution that I thought could improve the situation of linguistic inequalities in Cuba, and is one that I have been taking part in for 2 years now, and was the emergence of a community project, Seeds of Change, that has been whose aim has been improving children's accessibility to qualified language teachers and to quality language education in culture in a specific impoverished community in Havana. So I decided to do this because I was doing a volunteering work in that community and realized the challenges these children were facing. So I came up with this project that brings university students who are being trained to become English language teachers and translator and interpreters. So as a collaborative group, we go together there to teach English to these children using creative arts, like doing it differently, like in the school, but with English songs, with drama plays, with drawings and games that engage them into learning. And so far, I would say this project has evolved into a very dynamic group, and involving these university students who, I mean, more or less like 20 university students coming out and for and out, and around 30 school children as well. So I argue in my paper that even though many more seats or actions should be taken for English language instruction in Cuba to be more equitable, I think this kind of projects and seeds of change is a vehicle, a positive vehicle to achieve and to get there.
I love everything about that, honestly. I'm a huge advocate of grassroots movements and also collaborative efforts. And I think it's always a great idea to get university students involved, not just because this can be a beneficial partnership with the university students and the kids, like that's the obvious thing, but I think it does a lot when kids can also see themselves in these university students, and at the same time these university students really have a lot to share and to give back. So I love everything about this, and I think Ruanni shares this as well, because in the chat he's saying please elaborate more on this project in the sense that, like, institutionally, is there any support? What are some of the challenges from the local community? What's their response been like? So if you could kind of expand on this a bit more.
Yes, we have had support of the university since the beginning, because this was the first community project that we had at the Faculty of Foreign Languages. So everyone was very eager and very much involved into working there and seeing the development of what this could bring about. But of course, we have faced many challenges in a bureaucratic country like Cuba is, and also the involvement of the parents in the community. Like, we found a place in the community to teach, but then we face the challenge of parents not being involved and not bringing children to the classes. So sometimes we had there like the university students having prepared the class and having all the materials and everything, and then children were not showing up. So that was one of the main ones. And then we decided for different stages of the project, just going directly to the school and teaching there. So yeah, it has not been an easy path, but we have been promoting that and escalating, and so far it's already 2 years, and I am positive that is going to, like, that's my aim, like, to expand its scope to go to other communities and maybe to other parts of Cuba as well, not just Havana.
That's actually the question that I was going to ask you. Like, do you have, like, what's the next couple of years looking like for this project? Is it like a one and done kind of thing, or is it like planning to grow? And I'm really happy to hear that you do have plans to grow this program. And I guess maybe a piece of advice for anyone who's thinking of doing something of this sort. What's one piece of advice you would give to someone who's looking to do this in their own schools or their own community?
Well, one piece of advice would be like to know your students, to know your community, and then come up with a plan or a policy that addresses their needs, their interests, what this community, because it's different for everyone. Like, it's very particular. The case in Cuba is very different than in case in Pakistan or in China. So I would say know your students. So this is something that Ruanni also was always telling us in our classes. So know your students, know also the supporters that you have, like the people that you have around you, and then come together in a group and work together for that.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We'll move on to Maria. The question is, can there be change? Can we do something about the inequality? And also feel free if you want to respond to anything Elizabeth said so far. Yeah, go right ahead.
Well, I think the initiative is quite good, and I'm not sure, but Ruanni did ask, is this a personal initiative or a part of a teacher's training program? So, Elizabeth, do you want to answer that?
Yeah. Oh, I just saw that.
I didn't see it. It was a personal. Sorry, what was the question again?
Is this a personal initiative or part of the teacher's training program?
It started being a personal initiative of mine, and then it became part of the university's teaching program. So some students now do their internships like as part of their for completing their bachelor's, they need to do internship in several stages. So one of the stages and one of the places where do their internships is in the teaching and the community project.
That's quite impressive.
Yeah.
I'm quite impressed at how like it grew like, and her initiative became so.
If I can jump in, Maria, I'm so sorry, but like, is there, I don't know, but is there like a link or like an Instagram page or TikTok or anything where people can learn a bit more about this project, or not yet?
Well, we're working on that. Like, technology is not something in Cuba we are great about, but yes, we are actually one of the university students involved is taking now part of creating the communications of the project. Like, and we already have an Instagram page, Seeds of Change Cuba. And there are not many posts, but we're planning to start like sharing what we're doing and what we've done and how the project is evolving.
Awesome. I think once some stuff is set up, or even now, if you want to just drop the links in the chat or pass it off to Ruanni's so that he can share, I think that would be really great, because I think it's all of our little ears are like, ooh. But yeah, back to you, Maria. I'm so sorry. I had to jump in there.
Yeah, that her project was quite interesting. I think it's a good initiative. And with regards to my paper, I feel that, as we discussed, the ground realities are quite different. The initiative is good because it put an idea forward to break down the educational inequalities across. There is always a big gap between private education and government education, and it's continuing that cycle of of the class system, of the opportunities as well. So generally the initiative was good, but the realities and how it is implemented, I think there had to be more done in implementing the initiative, and considering one of my personal views is considering how multilingual Pakistan is, you cannot impose mother tongue based education or national language based education or even English only. It always has to be all three in some way introduced there. So the problem now is to find a way to implement having all three in education system. So generally, like, I feel that the earlier languages are introduced to students, the quicker they're able to learn them or have exposure to them. And in primary schools, if children are quite versatile and they can adapt to learning different languages. So maybe introducing an initiative where the focus is to learn the language more than learn the knowledge or the subject, such as there's like sciences, or introduce languages first and then go into sciences and maths. And so I think that's what I would propose.
I think it's interesting that you take a language acquisition lens, like kind of starting language acquisition in all three, as you say earlier. I'm curious to know, before this change was introduced, did the government conduct like consultation with various teachers from the private school system, from the government school system? Like, was that done? Because prior to imposing a change, I'm sure there must have been some kind of stakeholder consultation or feedback, but is that a thing? If you're not aware of it, like, do you think that would be a good idea for that?
Yes, I don't think they did it with the teachers as such, but I think that the education officers but then again, education officers don't know the ground realities of what is being taught and how it has to be taught. So again, when something is implemented, there is meant to be some like that would cause some resistance from the teachers and from the schools as well at times. So obviously that was the problem there.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we'll go to Ru Chen because we only have a few minutes left. So we'll go to Ru Chen to answer this question, and then we'll do kind of like a final concluding piece. So Ru Chen, the question is, can there be change? So based off of what you've discussed, in your paper, do you discuss some next steps and what we can do about mitigating some of these inequalities?
Actually, in my paper, I didn't say much about how to solve this problem. But I have thought about this question that I think because of the language policy is that we should use the Mandarin Chinese in classroom, so it may cannot be changed because there do have some advantages if we use the Mandarin Chinese in classroom, because like China have many provinces and we have different dialect. If we want to communicate fluently with people from other provinces, we should use some like lingua franca, like Mandarin Chinese speak with each other. So I think as for the concerns that people, if people speak dialogue in classroom, they will feel isolated or sometimes feel that shameful. I think the schools may can like kind of change the school language policy. Like for example, in some informal classroom activities such as like break or some other like culture classes, schools can allow students to use their dialogue in this kind of times. I think that's one way that can solve the problem.
I mean, that's a big change, and I think there's a lot of standard language ideologies that hold a lot of these initiatives back. So hopefully we can get to a point where that is, in an ideal world, obviously.
Yeah, I think
that's a great solution. But yeah, so thank you very much. We are just to wrap up, anyone have any concluding thoughts? And also to the audience, if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I know I've asked too many questions, so sorry guys. But is there anything you guys want to say just to wrap it all up? I'll open the floor to you guys, panelists. Whoa, one at a time, please. Okay, Maria, you unmuted, so I'm gonna pick on you.
I think linguistic inequalities are generally really a complex subject to address. You have to, but the important aspect is the awareness of it. And now that there is much more research going on in this domain, and addressing these issues effectively. So there is some start in addressing them. I think it will take time, but now we're reflecting on this, and that is a positive step towards addressing linguistic inequalities. And I think it's also very important because like we all know language is part of everything in our life. So it's important to address them. That's what I would say. And
yeah,
Thanks, Elizabeth.
I agree with you. I think like addressing any kind of inequalities is a challenging path and challenging process. And in this case, education and educational or linguistic inequalities is what we're discussing today is even more challenging. So what I would say is like if we can take steps towards the change in our position as teachers, as policymakers, or as any position that we have in our roles in our countries, that's a good start. Like even little steps that can lead to then greater changes, and see how we want our community, what we want our community to become and to have.
Thank you so much. Ruchan, any last final thoughts? You're on mute. Okay, perfect.
I think for me, and as to the language inequality in classroom, my thought is that it is not that easily to change some phenomena or the language policy. And I think what teachers may do is that they should sometimes they should not that mean to students. They should not link the using dialect with being uneducated. That will be great influence on the student confidence when studying.
Definitely. That's a big one, actually. And I think all of us can agree that teachers have a huge impact on our relationship with learning, with knowledge acquisition, and with school in general. So obviously, if we have negative experiences with teachers themselves, that's going to greatly impact so much more than just the school, right?
can I just add something?
Of course.
I was just wondering, like,
please.
So something just popped up in my mind. We were having our previous module with Dr. Jennifer Eddy, and she had this online platform where teachers could plan the lessons and then put it forward. In the same way, it's just a proposal to have a global online platform where we can collaborate on addressing or putting ideas forward in maybe even smaller ideas to address like these linguistic inequalities, whether for teachers in classroom or a bigger policy-making change. I think that would make a big difference, because someone can have, it would be a good step forward in addressing these.
Absolutely. For sure. And just to tie everything together, I think as we're seeing, future generations, we're only going to have more and more hybrid identities. You know, we're not going to have like bounded repertoires, like I only speak this type of Spanish or I only speak this type of English. And I know that a lot of our discussions, it's around standard language ideologies or the imposition of national versus mother tongue versus English language teaching. But I also think that the way things are going, it'll be interesting to see how all of us who speak all these different things kind of actually, you know, translanguaging is definitely one of the starts of it. But I think in the future, it'll be interesting to see how we all adapt to everyone's mixed linguistic repertoire. Spanglish, the mix of Spanish and English. I know, you know, if you said that 20 years ago, it's like, oh no, you can't. But now it's becoming more societally acceptable, perhaps in the cultural and arts scene. So that's just one example that I can think of where we're seeing more and more hybridity in language use as a whole. So it'll be interesting to see how future education curricula address that. So that's my concluding 2 cents. And with that, I'll pass it back to Ruanni for our third item. And I want to thank all the panelists so much for sharing your wonderful, wonderful papers and your views. And I hope I did a good job facilitating, because I'm running on little sleep and a lot of caffeine.
Thank you very much, Farhana. I think Peter Browning said here also very, great moderation. And also very interesting work as well for everybody. And actually, before I have a minute before we start, and I'd really also would like to thank all of you, like Elizabeth, Marie, and Ruchen. Actually, your last few statements actually somehow gave me a lot of hope that somehow the reason why we are putting these together is actually to start off some kind of like a global conversation. As you can see, even just this panel, all right, I'll exclude the earlier panels, right? But even just panel, we have different sort of experiences from China, from Cuba, from Pakistan as well. We have different experiences on the ground, but at the same time also somehow similar problems and similar challenges. So what actually Maria said earlier about, you know, why not, you know, put up something that might actually be a much more global kind of initiative. And I think this is, you know, an initial step, I think, you know, for us to have these kinds of conversations. And hopefully these you know, this sort of like a graduate papers on language politics and education, we can involve more students from different universities and actually from different programs as well in UCL. So I think there's much hope with that. So thank you very much again. Okay, so it's 10:40. And yes, it's bringing local conversations to global stages. I think that's wonderful. That's a great tagline. I think I need to screenshot now for Hannah. All right. So
in another life, I did marketing. In another life.
All right. Okay. Thanks for that. All right. So the third panel, another fascinating set of presentations. This one really focused more on like questions of access, language ideology, but also access to education as well. And we also have really fascinating presentations here. So let's start off with Florence. Hi, Florence.
Good morning, everyone. I will just share my screen and get the presentation up, hopefully. I am also terrible with Zoom, so I apologize in advance. Okay, desktop share. Okay, hopefully can everyone see this okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Step 1 done. I would just also try and hide this. Oh, so my presentation. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to move. Apologies. I can't come out of it now. Right. I'm gonna just move this so then I have better. There we go. Okay, so my paper is on Ofsted and EAL, talking about a trajectory of erasure and its impact on secondary schools in Southeast London. So we're going into a UK context. And to start off with, just to explain what EAL is, or at least how the Department for Education define EAL in England. They say that pupils recorded as having English as an additional language if they're exposed to a language at home that's known or believed to be other than English. It's not a measure of English language proficiency or a good proxy for recent immigration. And this was stated by DFE in 2020. Just to give a brief context on what Ofsted is, in case anyone's unfamiliar with this organisation, it's an inspectorate that looks at the quality of education of schools in England specifically. It stands for the Office for Standards in Education, Children's Services and Skills, and it was founded about 1992. It is a non-ministerial department, which means it's technically independent of government, but it is accountable to Parliament and often does mirror what the government would like to see in education. And inspections take place every 4 years approximately, and there are different ratings that a school could receive. However, of late, Ofsted have come under a bit of fire for certain policies and practices. They've been challenged by academics and by teaching unions such as the NEU. And from 2019, in terms of EAL, all reference has been abolished completely within their inspection frameworks and handbooks, and including, they used to have a national lead for EAL, which you can see on the right. His name was Mark Sims. And he worked for Ofsted for 16 years as the lead inspector for EAL. But in 2019, that was completely abolished. So moving on a little bit, in terms of the research questions that my paper addresses and the methods, the questions I wanted to look at specifically were, is there an erasure of EAL learners in Ofsted's policies and practices? And if erasure is found to be the case, what is its impact on EAL in secondary schools? I was particularly interested in this, just to give a quick background on myself, because I've been working in schools for 7 years, and 5 years, the last 5 years particularly, as an EAL practitioner. And I saw a bit of change in my time that I've been working, and I work in the borough of Lewisham. So that is what my the area that my research concentrated on. So phase 1 of my research was looking at document analysis, looking at a series of Ofsted publications between a timeline of 2001 to 2023. And there was analysis of 10 secondary school inspection reports in the borough of Lewisham from 2019 onwards, which I cross-checked with prior inspection school reports to see if there was any difference in how EAL was addressed. And the second phase was interviews. So I conducted 3 semi-structured interviews with 3 specialist EAL practitioners who are actively working in the field. Some elements of key research which informed my paper, there were academics such as Cushing and Schnell and Perryman as well, who did a lot of work on Ofsted. So, for example, Cushing and Schnell, they looked at archived past inspection reports, inspection reports and publications as well, and found that there was a historical regulation of non-standard English use in schools. And often this portrayal emerged of where non-standardized and minoritized speakers were seen as linguistically deficient, which is quite disturbing. As well, Cushing is quite critical of deficit discourses found in Ofsted's publications, notably the English Research Review, which talks about the word gap ideology and kind of presents vocabulary as the solution for combating structural inequalities, and also shifts blame onto schools and I suppose students and their families for not having vocabulary knowledge. And that is why they are struggling. Whereas we know, of course, there are a lot more structural inequalities at play. Also, Perryman and a few other researchers speak about a surveillance culture created by Ofsted, where schools take on board to such a great extent the criteria required by Ofsted that they internalize it And they then perform in accordance with this. And that often takes, that's reflected by schools' policies of what they prioritize as well. They often prioritize what Ofsted is looking for. And then finally, I was also looking at Gogolin's monolingual habitus, which kind of speaks about the teacher's role in the classroom of reinforcing monolingual ideology, which can often be quite unconscious, where like linguistic diversity is disregarded in the classroom, as well as Gao and Irvin's definition of erasure, which I believe is quite important because EAL we will see whether EL is indeed erased within the policies of Ofsted. So turning to the policies, some key findings that I found was that in 2001, Ofsted released quite a comprehensive guidance on for inspectors. It was aimed for inspectors, but could also be used for schools for EL provision. It was 24 pages long, and it was very, very useful, very detailed. Then, in 2003, in their Common Inspection Framework, there was one mention of EAL in section 45. So there was a bit of EAL already there. In 2013, however, in the Inspector's Handbook, EAL then becomes a mention in a footnote, and it's mentioned alongside students with protected characteristics. There is also some separate guidance, but it's greatly, greatly condensed in comparison to the 24-page guidance that was released in 2001. As well, when we turn to 2019 up to 2023, the Education Inspection Framework and Handbooks, there is no reference to EAL made whatsoever. And in the small sample of recent Ofsted school reports in Lewisham, 7 schools had no mention of EAL made, and only one explicit mention was made regarding support. So within policies and publications that I could find, there does definitely seem to be an erasure of EAL there. Then turning to the interview key findings, I won't be going through all of these individually, but the main findings were that EAL specialists were not often addressed by inspectors when inspectors came to the schools. They were often addressed to other members of staff, such as school librarian. Also, in terms of management, there was less emphasis on EAL given by management, as can be seen by number 3, for example. Despite specialists saying that they had quite positive relationships with management and given regular platforms to train staff. Then there might be some impact as well found in terms of attitudes by teachers on home language use in the classroom. Lessons did seem to be quite monolingual, as seen by number 4, and there was often a conflation between EL and SEN, in that EL students were placed in the same classrooms as SEN students. And there was some difficulty with encouraging teachers to differentiate for EL students in classes. And of course, all the specialists disagreed with the removal of EAL from the inspection framework and handbook. So just to conclude, there is a complete erasure from what I've found, at least in my research, within policies and publications over this timeline. And there was only one single mention of EAL in a school inspection report in one of the schools in Lewisham, one of the secondary schools. That EAL leads are not really approached by inspectors. And there's a possible tendency now for EAL to be less central in the eyes of management. However, there are limitations to my paper because it's a small-scale sample. It's a small-scale study and sample of both school reports and specialists interviewed, so it can't represent the whole of England. And a lot of publications, Ofsted publications, were not publicly accessible, so there may have been some policies that I might have missed. And we can't really assume that there's a direct causation between Ofsted's erasure of EAL and reported practices within schools. So this would definitely be an area of further study. And future research could consider investigating a wider sample of school reports and conducting further interviews with EAL practitioners. And here are a list of references, which you may have a look as well after. But that's essentially my presentation. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Florence, yeah, I was supposed to ask, I mean, before I go to Farhana's question, actually, there's one question that actually also Mingdan asked, why is this topic important to be studied? I wrote here as well something similar. I mean, because the first slide you wrote, in one of your research questions was, is there erasure? Why erasure? Is this something that emanates from an experience, for example, and then you started feeling it and trying to probably put together a research design in order to probably properly investigate this?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, it's very interesting. I do believe, as I've been working in school with EL students for 5 years, there has been a slight difference in the way that management have approached EAL. EAL does seem to be less mentioned. For example, when we have whole staff meetings, EAL is not often mentioned unless we are quite vocal about it, whereas previously it did seem more in the spotlight. So that's why I thought it was interesting and important to investigate erasure, especially because schools are so bound to the outcomes of inspections that Ofsted run. And so the less that EL is prioritised by Ofsted, and essentially now Ofsted see all students holistically. However, they do still mention SEND students separately, but EAL is kind of categorized with the same as all students. So the less that EAL students are mentioned, the less visible they are in the eyes of schools. So that's why I think it's quite an important area to investigate.
All right, thank you. Farhana's question here is, what are some of the criticisms of EAL by academics and teachers unions? Are there criticisms of EAL?
Criticisms of EAL? I didn't really investigate.
Or probably perceptions of EAL.
Perceptions of EAL. So perceptions of EAL, when I was interviewing with the specialists, they did speak about how it was difficult sometimes to get teachers to differentiate for EAL students. And one specialist mentioned that it took a while for them to encourage, to get all staff on board with allowing home language use in classes, for example. So there was kind of a perception that all students should be speaking English, I suppose. And that does need to be looked into more. That's why EL practitioners are quite important to have in schools, and that training is done regularly. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. One last thing. So how, in general, in your observation, how are the teachers coping? I mean, how are the EL teachers coping? Like there's erasure, there are some institutional or infrastructural challenges. How are they coping?
They are struggling because a lot of, first of all, in many schools, EL departments don't exist, or if they do exist, it's often it just consists of one member of staff. Who is often not a teacher themselves. They might just be a teaching assistant. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but a lot of responsibility is placed on their shoulders of one member of staff. In a school, for example, of 800 students, especially if you're looking at a city like London, for example, you could have 400 or 500 of those students be English as an additional language students. And of course, within EAL, there are many different, it's not a homogenous group. There can be students with a lower proficiency of English. There can be students that were born here. A lot of those students have different needs. So to have one member of staff to address all the needs of those students is not very fair, and they are struggling, I suppose.
Yeah, massive challenges. Yeah,
yeah.
All right, yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks very much, Florence. And I hope that this research of yours doesn't stop here, because I think this is something that's very much needed. Not in only in the literature, but really in practice, because I've observed that as well in the schools of my kids here. Yeah. So thank
Thank you.
you. Thanks very much. All right, let's move on to Rendell. Hello, Rendell.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Let me share my slides first. Okay. Hold on. I'm also bad with technology. I'm so sorry. Okay. So while I'm setting this up, good morning, everyone. My name is Rendell Sanchez. I'm currently an MA student in Applied Linguistics at UCL's IOE. And I'm currently writing my dissertation based on this paper, which is entitled Justifying the Mother Tongue-Based Multilingual Education, or MTB-MLE, Policy in the Philippines, Policy Preferences of Epistemic Communities and Policymakers. Just to give you a brief background about myself, I was a language and literature teacher back in the Philippines before I went here. So I'm very much interested in the language in education policies implemented by the government. So more background about the Philippines. So I came from an archipelago with a very diverse sociolinguistic makeup. So we have around 180 languages. Most of them are indigenous and some of them are migrant. But for the longest time, our mandated language of instruction in schools is bilingual. So it only includes English and then the national language, Filipino, which is mostly based on Tagalog, one of the dominant spoken languages in the Philippines. But then it changed in 2013 when the mother tongue-based multilingual education policy was implemented. And it is mandated that in instructions for primary school from kinder to grade 3, they have to use the 19 mother tongues. And there is an allotted subject to teach how to speak the mother tongue and literature in the mother tongue. So for a mother tongue to be used for instruction, you have these requirements. You have to have an orthography or a spelling guide, big books. These are contextualized storybooks based on the language, literature, and culture of the ethno-linguistic group, and then a dictionary or at least a glossary, a grammar guide, and then the presence of a teacher who's fluent in the language. So for years, local scholars have proven or have looked into the effectiveness of the MTB-MLE policy in terms of student achievement. So it is reflected in their test score. So you have here higher achievement, a more positive perception of their culture and Philippines as a nation, enhanced literary appreciation, same with increased student motivation and engagement. And I think this is an important one. Increased reader engagement and increased visibility and symbolic value attributed to the mother tongues. But the implementation also faces not only logistical, but also ideological challenges. So in terms of logistics, there's a lack of allocated funds for operational activities, which leads to non-compliance to the minimum requirements that I discussed earlier. And then according to the scholarship of Dr. Tupas, he explains that there is an inequality of multilingualism, and it's influenced by factors such as prioritization of English due to linguistic imperialism and globalization. And I think it started with our being a post-colony of the US. And it, in terms of symbolic value, there also is a colonially induced hatred towards mother tongues. So I became interested in writing about this primarily because the data was made available on Facebook. So the public hearings about the suspension of the policy was uploaded by one of the senators of the Philippines, Senator Win Gatchalian, who is the chairman of the Committee on Basic Education, where they deliberate the pros and cons of carrying on with the policy. And he invited some language experts who are also advocating for language inclusion and diversity. And there are four hearings, and I only watched two. I'm gonna cover four for my dissertation. So what I did was I watched the videos, and then I identified this pattern of interaction wherein the policymaker would raise a concern, and then the implementers and the language experts would respond. So I identify these, categorize them, and then I transcribe the relevant excerpts for analysis. So to make sense of the data, I kind of borrowed from international policy because I wanted to know how much of the input from the language experts were taken into consideration in the actual decision-making process. So I got the framework of expert influence, and under that, there's also an operational term, which is epistemic communities, which refers to the group of experts, scholars, and professionals. And in this case, you have here language experts like the main implementers who are the representatives of the Department of Education. We have language experts from the Summer Institute of Linguistics, Komisyon ng Wikang Filipino, which advocates for the national language, and other groups which are advocating for linguistic inclusion and diversity. And then I aim to surface mainly the policy preferences. So these are the worldviews, beliefs about cause and effect relationships, and ideas about appropriate policy solutions. So this is my main finding, is that the policymakers' key concerns can be attributed to low fidelity policy implementation. So what is low fidelity policy implementation? It is a kind of a deviation from the designed way of implementation by the policy. So it's characterized by inconsistencies, by what else? Basically, it's not pedagogically flawed. The pedagogical principles of the policy is not the problem, but it is a matter of execution. So these are the concerns that I found. So there's a perceived contribution to declining English proficiency rates, deviations from the law, non-compliance with minimum standards, and delayed outcomes. So this is how the dialogues between the policymakers and the epistemic communities transpired. So first, the one of the senators said that the MTB MLE can be a source for this, or the reason for the declining English proficiency rates among Filipinos over the past few years, and that we actually have to introduce our learners to English as early as possible because we have this big labor market demand for English-speaking laborers. So they actually cited the business process outsourcing industry or call centers, which are in need of more English-speaking Filipinos. But the experts would argue that the policy does not actually hinder, but in fact promotes the learning of English through the cross-linguistic transfer of literacy. So that means that through learning phonological awareness, vocabulary, writing skills, comprehension skills, they can learn another language better. And then they also cited that in standardized exams, multilingual learners actually perform better and score higher. The next one is deviations from the law. One of the senators said that there's a mismatch in the materials available and then the actual mother tongues of the learners. But then the main implementers, representatives from the Department of Education, said that there are mandated measures to minimize these, such as classroom sectioning or grouping the learners based on their mother tongues and local production of learning materials. It is highly encouraged that if their mother tongue is not covered by the 19, then they're highly encouraged to create their own and have them approved later on by the Department of Education. And then third one, non-compliance with the minimum requirements for implementation. the language experts would argue that we have to appreciate incremental achievement or kind of a partial implementation. So we can see a nuanced view of implementation. So it just means that, for example, they don't have a copy of the orthography yet, which is something that is difficult to produce. But if they do have a storybook, or if they have a simple glossary of the mother tongue, then that should be counted as a measure of success and not grounds for suspension. So instead they should see that as a way to identify which mother tongues or which areas are in need of more help in terms of budgeting and logistics. And then last but not the least, delayed outcomes. The senators have been saying that it has been 10 years since the implementation of the policy. Why are we still experiencing these struggles? So is it really feasible to cover all of the mother tongues? But then the language experts would say that local community alignment takes time. So it has to go through a lot of processes, such as conducting dialogues with the community to get to know their language, their tradition, their culture, to be reflected in their learning materials, to foster a sense of ownership. And then there has to be, to expedite the process, there has to be collaboration with other stakeholders, such as Commission on Higher Education, so that they can incorporate in their teacher education programs things like mother tongue education and language preservation. So with these findings, my main argument or key takeaways from this paper is that the main challenge of MTB-MLE is low fidelity policy implementation, and that these concerns are operational in nature and are feasibly solvable. So suspension, I believe, is not the solution, but instead it's more support, it's more investment towards the policy if they genuinely believe in the cause of promoting linguistic inclusivity. But I think they are hindered by my next few takeaways, which is that the investment in English still prevails due to neoliberal capitalist discourses, that they do prioritize they still privilege English because of, again, the demands of the labor market. And then third, the role of ideology is central in the decision making. The diversity of mother tongues is seen as a liability instead of a resource. Just like what I mentioned earlier, suspension should not be the solution if they value mother tongues equally as much as they value English and the national language, Filipino. And then last but not the least, going back to my theoretical framework, that the epistemic community has responded empirically and logically, but their input has not been considered in policy decisions, thus making expert influence minimal. So yeah, that's my presentation, and here are my sources. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Randall. Yeah, thanks. Well, I also work in the area of MTB-MLE and are aware of these challenges, but listening to this paper, it still makes me sad, you know? It still makes me sad because as you can see, and then as you really brilliantly pointed out, there's really a misalignment, right? No one questions the validity or the usefulness or the sophistication of the use of mother tongues, for example, in efficient teaching and learning. I think everyone thinks and everyone believes that it actually works, but people are actually looking into implementational problems. And I would like to say about Mignan also says, yes, it's really sad. And I would like to say that this is a centuries old problem, you know, because early on when, let's say, for example, the English language was imposed on Philippine education at the start of the American colonization in 1900s, implementational problem was also key to you know, like, all right, you know, how can you manage, you know, all these different Philippine so-called dialects, which are of course languages. You know, we wouldn't be able to do this and that, and it's going to be, you know, it's not going to be efficient teaching and so on and so forth. So in other words, it's still the same. And if we go back to the same old problem, it's really going to be the same sort of, future that we are going to have. But I'm interested, and then I also agree, you said that central to decision making is language ideology, right? Um, that it's, liability of language, the mother tongues are viewed as a liability rather than as a resource. I wonder whether this actually surfaced in the conversations, I mean in the hearings, because I think in your data you talk about the implementational problems and the questions, right? But I wonder whether these ideologies actually also circulate.
Well, I came up with that point because throughout the hearings, I think because I'm listening now to the third and fourth hearings as well, they see it as a logistical hindrance.
Oh, okay.
They always say that how is it going to be possible? And then they use different data and statistics proving that actually we have way more languages and it will be impossible and impractical for us to cover. But even if the implementers and the language experts have been offering very much like viable solutions, they just need a lot of budgetary and logistical support from the government. I think the easy way to deal with it is to just again suspend. But I think like personally, again, I emphasize the importance of ideology because I think as long as we value them the same way that we value English and Filipino, then it should not be an issue that we can easily invest on these governmental processes.
So what's your take on hearings like this one? It seems like, all right, the epistemic communities have been invited. I think it's by law that when you change certain parts of the law, you need to invite researchers and different stakeholders. So they have to be brought into the researchers. And yet the suspension is still, the way to go. So somehow, what's your sense? Where was there listening?
Oh, sadly, sir, what I found is that also prior to because I was also reading a lot of scholarship on expert influence. It's in the realm of international policy and lobbying. Um, Sometimes or a lot of times, these hearings are only used to kind of nitpick or like cherry pick some of the con just to do like a confirmation bias of the uh
Yeah,
preconceived stance of the policymakers.
yeah,
So it's more of, oh, if you say something that would support the policymakers' argument, then they will stick to that.
yeah,
And that's currently what I am investigating in my dissertation
yeah.
because now I'm also looking at the final policy documents, like the final suspension, the press releases, and then it's sad to see that there's a big disconnect between what transpired during the hearings and then the final decisions.
Mm,
So
mm, yeah.
in terms of listening, I don't think there's a lot of
Oh,
listening
yeah.
that was done by the policymakers.
So in other words, it was a lot of performing, but
It's very,
I
yeah,
think when all this consultation started, they already have made up their mind, I think.
exactly.
That's very sad. So anyway, I mean, but all the best in your research, and I hope this gets
Thank you.
out in national newspapers back in the Philippines, because I think we need this kinds of coherent discussion, right, of the issue. So thanks, Rendell. All right.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Yeah,
everyone.
yeah, thank you. And for Hannah, your turn.
Hi. Hopefully you can see me. Yeah, so I'm sure by now you all are sick of seeing my face and hearing me talk. But yeah, I'm gonna start sharing my screen. Okay. All right. So hopefully you all can see that. And so I'm not able to see the chat, FYI. So at the end, I'll be able to see and take any questions. But so good morning, everyone. as you know by now already, my name is Farhana, and I'm currently studying intercultural communication at the IOE at the MA level. So today I'll be presenting my paper, which is on how higher education institutions in the US and the UK export whiteness through promoting elite bilingualism. So I'm taking a bit more of a theoretical approach with my paper. And I cover this by the research question, how is elite bilingualism being operationalized by universities to reproduce this whiteness? And to answer this, I didn't conduct any primary research or anything. I actually analyzed 3 case studies from 3 different papers. So the first university that I looked at was at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, and what they engaged in as also known as unmarking Spanish. And I touched on that a little bit later in the presentation. But for the purpose of this slide, the other 2 studies that I looked at were the Posh Talk study and the multilingual university studies, both by the scholar Priest, and they took place in 2 different London universities. So the overall conclusion that I drew from the analysis of these studies is that, in fact, whiteness is being reproduced in higher education, and then this is being done through reinforcing linguistic hierarchies depending on the linguistic repertoires of the students. And to take it a step further, this is done through marketing particular languages as indispensable for economic success, social capital, so on and so forth. So I discuss more key takeaways later on in the presentation. But before I get into any of that, I do want to go over some of the key concepts that formed the basis of the theoretical approach of my paper. As you can see on the screen, I used the concepts of whiteness, elite bilingualism, and standard language ideology to guide my thoughts and analysis. So there are many definitions of whiteness, particularly according to the field that you are looking in. So based off of a lot of the literature, I decided to go with the definition of whiteness through an amalgamation of various scholars like McIntosh, Grimes, and Glenn, etc., to basically define it as what it's not. And this is done through disguising itself as a supposed universal and neutral construct. And in terms of language policy, Nelson Flores talks about bilingual hegemonic whiteness, which is the expectation that students speak standardized varieties of English and a dominant national language. And this actually aligns with the concept of elite bilingualism, which is essentially that, proficiency in standardized varieties of English. And when we say standardized, I mean American English, British English, shout outs to Canada, Canadian English, but basically the elite, though, in elite bilingualism signals that these speakers benefit from a position that's not awarded to other bilinguals who speak maybe languages that are not institutionally recognized as valuable. And when I say valuable, I mean it doesn't have, like, let's say, social prestige or economic value. So, you know, all of this, how does this even relate to whiteness then? Well, despite not necessarily being white themselves, elite bilinguals are in proximity to whiteness. And I actually discussed this later on in the presentation, and that is how the reproduction of whiteness as an ideology is reproduced. So last but not least, standard language ideology. We've heard this term a number of times in today's event. And it was covered in one of the earlier presentations, I believe Nuria's, that it is the belief in fixed boundaries of language into standard and non-standard forms. And what's not surprising is that this standard is created and maintained by, you know, social groups who historically have had the power to do so. Who are they? Well, Western, white, male, upper class, etc. And yeah, these ideologies further perpetuate whiteness. So in terms of the discussions on elite bilingualism, I have done a lot of reading looking at eliteness in higher education, bilingualism in higher education, and then together how they work off of each other. And so I did pay particular attention to how scholars described the way students from privileged and marginalized backgrounds mobilized their linguistic repertoires to access the resources. So I kind of paid attention to that, the class aspect as well. So Nelson Flores, for example, links English-speaking multilinguals to the service of neoliberal expansion. Now, what does that mean? It means language acquisition and linguistic diversity are understood as assets to market yourself and to commodify yourself for the purpose of, let's say, gaining jobs, gaining an employment, I should say, in transnational corporations, admissions in higher education institutions, so on and so forth. And this kind of ties into what Priest says about how social mobility depends on your class and your access to resources. So your social class determines your ability to access various symbolic and material resources for the purpose of upward social mobility. And you might be asking, okay, well, why is this important? What does this have to do with anything? Well, the reality is some languages are more valued than others, and that touches all of us in every single way. Now, personally, my own experience actually has led me to investigate this further. So I speak a non-standardized variety of a language. So I am a Sileti speaker, which is fiercely debated as a dialect of Bengali or its own language. I am of the latter opinion. But the main thing here is that because of this positionality, it's led to feelings of inadequacy, imposter syndrome, identity crisis. Because when people ask me like, "Oh, you speak Bengali," and I'm like, "Yeah, I do." I can understand what you're saying, but I actually speak a different language entirely, Sileti, and that kind of leads to some interesting conversations. But not just actually my position as a speaker of a air quotes dialect. I'm just going to say dialect for the sake of it. But it's also, I come from a neighborhood with immigrants from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who primarily speak these non-standardized varieties and as well as heritage languages. And so, growing up, I was under the impression that I had to learn high value languages like French and Spanish to kind of improve my marketability and the job prospects. I didn't have fancy resumes and I didn't have internships and I didn't have a professional network to get me into the careers that I wanted to. So what really got me the interviews in the beginning was my formal training in French and Spanish. And ultimately, this got me thinking, well, why does the multilingualism of some people count but not others? I have been multilingual my whole life, but it only really seemed to matter and get me opportunities when I added French and Spanish into my linguistic repertoire. On its own, Bengali or Sileti and English were not enough. So, again, what's the main point of all of this? Well, I think it's on us to continuously question, what we think of as the status quo. We should really look into that because it's usually at the expense of a disenfranchised majority. So I'm not going to get into this model too much per se, but the reason why I wanted to even bring this up is to draw your attention to English located as a hypercentral language, and then these languages here are supercentral. So I should probably start off by saying what even is this model. This model groups languages. This model is by Abram de Swan, and it's a way to visualize how different languages in the world are assigned different values. The key takeaway of this is that this categorization is a result of Western white assumptions on what languages offer greater upward social mobility. And it's also not a coincidence that the languages that are in the supercentral category tend to be associated with historic colonial powers. And, again, this reinforces a Eurocentric worldview that places Western languages at the top of the hierarchy. So just to go back to some of the cases that I presented, I'll just go over these takeaways real quick. After reviewing all these cases, I found that whiteness is reproduced through unmarking languages as neutral in an effort to add value to these languages. So the key thing to remember here, and the egregious thing I should say to remember here, is to separate the language from the racialized bodies that speak them, all in an effort to further economic interests. So again, the co-option of the multilingualism of, racialized speakers. And then we did touch on this event earlier about this idea of reforming speakers of non-standardized languages or correcting the way people speak. And, these are all with the goal of bringing these speakers closer to this idea of a hegemonic white subject. So to recap, the status of an elite bilingual is awarded to your proximity to this ideal hegemonic white subject. And if we look ahead and try to talk about, well, what can we do about this? Decoloniality is a big thing right now, and rightfully so. We need to recognize that even in discourses of linguistic diversity, what languages are they talking about? What counts as diversity, right? What makes a language even count as a language? I just gave the example of me as a Sileti speaker that's fiercely debated as a dialect or a language. and also which ones are relegated to the margins and dismissed as simply heritage languages, right? So once we dig deep into these discourses, we recognize that all of these systems are set up around the idea that English is the key to success. English plus another dominant national language are the keys to economic success and social prestige. And we quickly just see that this is another form of modern day colonialism in action, and ultimately the spread of whiteness. So with that, thank you very much for attending today's event and listening in on my presentation. I hope we all walk away today questioning our own status as elite bilinguals or not as elite bilinguals, and also in the ways in which we uphold whiteness while simultaneously being impacted by it. So with that, thank you very much, and I will stop sharing my screen. So yeah, any questions?
Thank you very much, Farhana. Thank you. Fascinating theoretical way to address this issue. No, just a bit of clarification, probably not clarification, but elaboration, because you did mention about the unmarking of Spanish. Could you elaborate more on that? What exactly does it mean? I mean, in real, implementational, we've been talking about implementational matters. What happens if you're unmarking Spanish?
Yeah, so
or unmarking any standard language for that matter.
Right. Okay. So I did touch on this briefly, and because of time, I didn't get to go into it as much as I could. But essentially, the article that I used for inspiration was by Mike Mena and Ofelia Garcia, and they talked about how in the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, it's really important to know that the university is located in the Rio Grande Valley, which is at the border. It's a border area and of Mexico and the USA. So there's a lot of political tension, historical legacies there, and a particularly contentious relationship with Spanish language teaching. So it is quite amazing that this is the first bilingual Spanish-English university. But even then, there's still some issues because the people in the Texas Rio Grande Valley region, they speak a particular type of Spanish. And so what this university did, though, is to kind of come up with this neutral Spanish away from the people that live in that region, in particular to attract white, middle to upper class, standard language speakers. So these are the kids that went to school and learned standard Spanish. These are the kids that speak American English. And so to attract them and bring their money into the school, that's the type of Spanish that's being prioritized. So through unmarking it, you're adding value to Spanish with the hopes of attracting standard language speakers and actually changing the narrative on the type of Spanish that's spoken in that region, because you'll have an influx of speakers of that type. So I hope that clarifies.
Yes. So in other words, because the local Spanish or the marked Spanish is something that is valued in negative ways. Is that? Yeah, right. And they didn't want to
and this is where the standard language ideology comes in, because you have people living in these regions who are still having to prove that they know Spanish. Despite being from there. So it's interesting.
Excellent. Yeah, and one last thing. How do we move forward with this? Elite bilingualism, whiteness that is embedded in it is of course really part of the whole infrastructure, right? Educational infrastructure. Is there other spaces of change or possibilities that and somehow this can be addressed?
I think this is kind of the recurring theme in a lot of our presentations, where we're coming up with all these problems, but I'm not sure if the answer lies in a solution-oriented approach per se, as much as that pains me to say, because I am someone who is very solution-oriented. But I think that it's one of those things that, the most radical thing I can think of is, unless capitalism is, we get away from capitalism, it'll solve all of our problems. But that's obviously not realistic. But I guess going back to, for example, what Elizabeth said, bringing in grassroots based local changes is really how we can move forward. And I would suggest that to move forward in these types of spaces, we incorporate, we normalize people who don't speak standardized variety. So I'm going to give an example. So this is in English, obviously, there's standardized ways of speaking or whatever, but I am of the opinion that we normalize not using, for example, academic English in our papers, or when we give presentations, not speaking a particular way or whatever. And I think Nuria actually touches on this in her question.
Yeah. So you can address
so actually
that.
I'll address
Yeah.
that right now, because
Sure.
yes, to answer your question, Nuria, academic English is a way to reinforce whiteness, and the Posh Talk study does go into that. The key difference between the Posh Talk study and the multilingual university study is that the Posh Talk study examines Black, Asian, minority, ethnic students in its as its sample pool, and then the multilingual university study examines the international MA students. Guess which one is in closer proximity to whiteness? The multilingual university students, because in their societies, they're of the elite kind of class, and they come in with these standard languages. And so they have an easier time with academic English versus these students who grew up in impoverished or marginalized communities. They speak multicultural London English, so MLE, and they're in a program that seeks to remedy their English into academic English. So we already see the disparities, despite one population being from the UK and another population being outside of the UK, but they're faring better in terms of navigating the higher education space. So to tie all of this in together, the solution would be normalizing it, bringing in not just the way of speaking, but certain maybe epistemologies isn't the right word, but bringing in your way of either researching or looking at populations in a way that doesn't alienate them, or on the flip side, which is what I'm seeing, performative celebrations. That's something that I struggle with, particularly in the workplace. We talk about diversity this, diversity that, but even within these discourses, it's in a way that assumes that the norm was not diversity at one point, and we've come to a point where we've achieved it, and now we're full stop, we're done, and we don't need to talk about it anymore. So to answer this is my long-winded way of saying we need to keep talking about it, and we need to find new ways of bringing these discourses into the spotlight and talking about it.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you very much. Mingjian just said something about your presentation reminds her of a popular discursive joke among Chinese women. I want to be a middle-class white man if there is a next life.
I mean, I want to be one right now. They're winning. Heterosexual white men are winning. Like, why wouldn't I want to be that? If you can't beat them, join them.
Exactly. All right. So, well, what a way to end this series of presentations. So thank you very much, Farhana, and thank you very much everyone else who gave their time and who did really extremely well in their presentations and the conversations as well. And for those of you who joined us, thank you very much. We did not publicize this as much because we thought that perhaps the recording can also help later on. This is going to be accessible as soon as I get hold of the recording as well. So maraming salamat from that's thank you very much in Tagalog, and enjoy the rest of the weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Ruanni. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.